Welcome to today's Community Cast. My name is Matt Morgan. I'm the pastor at Community Brookside, a new church plant in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We are so blessed by your presence, and we hope that today's content will bring you joy.
So I've got to ask you a question. Have you ever seen like a super great movie? Yeah, right? Of course, right? What's your favorite movie?
Lord of the Rings, Return of the King.
Return of the King? Okay, good one. What else? What? That's one of my favorites, Emperor's New Groove.
Tin Cup.
You threw off my groove. Sorry, Tin Cup?
Yeah.
That's a good one. What are some of your favorite movies?
Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Mr. Smith Goes... What?
The Man from Snowy River.
I have not ever seen that one, The Man from Snowy River. Okay.
Tommy Boy.
Tommy Boy is a good one. Lots of really good exposition in the plot of Tommy Boy there. Oh, Romeo and Juliet. That's cute. Well, so it's clear that I think we all have movies that we really enjoy, but have you ever watched such a good movie that it blew your mind because things did not turn out the way you expected? Can you think of a movie off the top of your head that did that for you? Sixth Sense is a good one, right? Unusual Suspects or Usual? Usual Suspects? I have not seen that one. What is the deal? You watch cool movies. But there are oftentimes movies that we watch that sometimes throw us completely off track. So one of my favorite movies where this particular thing is very evident, it's, in fairness, I've got to be clear, it's not just one movie, it's a series of movies. It is the Harry Potter series. Have you ever seen those? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about those today. So listen, we are like 12 years removed from that or 20 years removed from that. If you have not seen the movie, I'm sorry. I'm giving away spoilers. It's your fault, okay? So before we go too far, I want you all to know that the hero of Harry Potter, I don't necessarily believe is Harry Potter. I mean, it's named after him, right? So you expect it to be Harry Potter. But I would tell you that there's a hero working in those movies behind the scenes in every single one of the movies that fights to protect Harry and win against the forces of he who shall not be named, right? There's this character that in each one of the movies seems to be working against Harry. It's almost as like he's hiding some sort of deep and dark evil inside of himself. He uses his position and his power to cripple the work of Harry Potter and is often portrayed as the antagonist in almost every situation Harry finds himself in. Throughout each film, we see that this particular character acts against the work of Harry and may even be in cahoots with the Dark Lord to bring an end to Harry Potter so that he and his henchmen can rule all of the wizarding world. What character do you think I'm talking about when I say that? Snape, right? It's Severus Snape is his name. And in each one of the films, he's depicted in all black at all times, right? He talks very much like this through his nose. And every facial expression is a cowl. Or wait, no, it's not a cowl. Scowl is the word. Batman wears a cowl, very different. But by the time that the last film comes around, we find ourselves watching Severus as he sits on the council of dark wizards, right? They have almost entirely taken over all of the wizarding world, and he is the right-hand man of whatever his name is, he who shall not be named. Voldemort, that's his name. But does anyone remember what happens in the very last movie? And don't tell me, just nod your head. Do you remember what happens in the last? So lots of head shaking, yes. In the very last movie, Severus Snape's true history is revealed. So there's this really convoluted plot point when Voldemort realizes that the most powerful wand in all of wizardry is what wand? Anybody know? The Elder Wand. And who owned the Elder Wand? Dumbledore, right? Oh, God, this is really getting complicated. So Dumbledore owns this wand. It's the best one in all the world. And in order for Voldemort to take over all of the wizarding world, he has to control that wand. But Dumbledore was killed by someone. That someone was Severus Snape, and it was all a part of a plan. The issue is when a wizard kills another wizard, that wand gets an attachment to the person who killed him. So in order for Voldemort to truly control all the world and the power of the wand, he has to kill his right-hand man, Severus Snape. And so he does this by having his snake, Nagini, attack him and bite him and kill him. And as Snape is dying, Harry's not too far off, and he shows up on the scene, and he's really angry because this whole time we expect that Severus Snape has been acting against Harry, but in his last moments, he gives Harry a vial of memories. And as Harry opens the vial of memories, we get to see Snape's true past. The entire time we thought that Severus Snape was a villain, but the whole time, even when we don't see what he's doing, he was working for the good and protecting those he loved. Apparently, Severus was in love with Harry's mother. And as Harry's mother lay dying, he made a vow that he would always protect Harry. And so even throughout all of the movies, we go through 7 3/4 movies before we realize that Severus has been working behind the scenes to protect and take care of and train and equip Harry to do what Harry was called to do. It's a great story and awesome movies. And my family gets to watch them about once a year, everybody except for my wife, who has other things to do conveniently when we watch Harry Potter. So anything else, right? So while the movies are called Harry Potter, I would say that maybe one of the biggest heroes in all of the series is somebody we don't expect, somebody we don't see doing all the work in the background. I believe that Severus Snape is one of the true heroes. And he's only revealed when we get to see a much bigger picture of what all of the events are happening throughout all of these movies. So now I hope you can see where I'm going, okay? I hope you realize I'm not preaching about Harry Potter today. I'm just trying to connect the general idea to how sometimes I feel like God acts. So many of us in this room think that we are the main hero in our story, don't we? I mean, if they were going to write a movie about your life, what would it be called?
Kate Francie.
Exactly. All of us would be called Kate Francie. No. But right, so we think that we're starring members in the movie about our own life, right? We are the starring role. But what we forget is that we are actually participants in God's story. Now, over the last few weeks, I've been reading and rereading the biblical story of Esther. Esther is a book in the Old Testament that we are going to be focusing on over the next few weeks. We're going to start today by recognizing that while the story is named for Esther, the hero of the book of Esther is God. God is working in the background. God is working behind the scenes for the good of his people. And it's surprising because not one time in the book of Esther is the name God ever mentioned. Not once. The events in the book take place so long ago that Jesus hasn't even been around on the scene yet. So he's not in the story either. But while God's name is never mentioned once, we can see, if we look closely in the story, that God is acting. We can see places where God shows up unexpectedly and he moves in ways that we don't see. So this morning, let's start our new sermon series called For Such a Time as This by looking at the characters in this very important Old Testament book. So if you have your Bibles, you can open them up to the book of Esther. It's in the Old Testament. We're going to go through a lot of scripture today, so hang with me, okay? I'll try to read it as absolutely fast as I can. Okay, I probably won't, but we're going to read a lot of scripture today, so hang on. So in the book of Esther, we're going to be introduced to the characters of the Persian king Xerxes and his wife named Vashti. We're going to be introduced to Haman, a royal friend and advisor to King Xerxes, and Mordecai and his cousin, who he raised as his own daughter, and his cousin's name is Esther. So let's read a little bit. If you want to follow along, you can follow along from Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. It'll be on the screen. Here's what Scripture says for us this morning. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. And by the way, let me just preface this with, I'm going to say a lot of names really wrong. Okay? So be ready. Back at it. Okay, this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. Do you guys know where Kush is? No? Guys, come on. You don't know where Kush is? It's okay. I had to look it up too. So it's Ethiopia. Thank you, Jeff Janes. I knew Jeff would know. So we're talking from India to Ethiopia. Asia to all of North Africa. It is a large empire. We'll talk more about that in a minute. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people, from the least to the greatest, who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold. Each one was different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink whatever he wanted with no restrictions. The king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him. And here are the names: Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him, thank you. Yes. To bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. So here we are, we're introduced to the first couple of characters in the story in the first chapter, and we already need to know a little bit more about who we're talking about. So we see that King Xerxes is the king of the time at the setting of this book. He is king of the Persian Empire, and it's said to stretch how many provinces? 127. From India to where? Ethiopia or Kush, right? So Kush is most often translated as Ethiopia, which is in the northern part of Africa. And it says that Xerxes is so powerful that his empire stretches all the way from the Indian Ocean up to the Mediterranean Sea, and all the way around the Mediterranean Sea up until you hit the Greek Empire. So that means he basically rules all of southern Asia, all of the northern parts of the Middle East, all of the ancient Near East, all of the Mesopotamian areas, all of North Africa, all the way to the borders of Greece. It is a huge empire. So we can see that Xerxes is kind of a big deal. And what do we know about his wife? She's hot, yeah. She's smoking. So smoking that he wants to parade her around his drunken friends at the end of a party. So we see that in this story, we're back at Susa. Do you know what Susa is? It's a capital in the Persian Empire. And apparently the Persian Empire had 3 different capitals, and the king would spend a different amount of time at each one. So being at Susa, it's probably during the months where he's planning and preparing for war. The implications of the location and the timing mean that he's probably prepping to attack the Greeks that we see that he later does in the years between 482 and 479 BCE. So after the planning is done, after he's got all of his generals together and he's got that all figured out, he throws a 7-day banquet. And at the end of the 7-day banquet, that's when he says, all right, bring my wife in. Right? So we know at the end of a 7-day banquet, people are, I don't want to use the word trashed, but I kind of want to use the word trashed. It's a lot of partying, right? And so what is her response? Yeah, no. That would be like me asking my wife to come and parade around in here. Like, hey, honey, stand up. Show everybody your good looks. Right? No. Is that weird? Should I not have done that? I'm sorry. I don't. She says no. She refuses the order of the king. And guys, that's a big deal. It's different if you disobey your husband. She does that all the time. But it's not the same thing as Vashti disobeying the orders of her husband, who's the king. Now, I'm the king of my castle, but not the king in like the whole Persian Empire. Right, when she's not there, I am totally king. So for directly disobeying the king's command, you find out later on that she is asked to never, and let's be clear, the king doesn't ask, he tells. The king tells her that he never wants to see her again. And he doesn't just say it like, listen, thank you for being so attractive, I don't want you anymore, you're out. He writes a decree. He has it translated into all the local languages and sends the decree out across all 127 provinces. He says, oh no, Vashti's out. That's a big deal. Decrees written by the kings of the Persian Empire are said to be irrevocable. Once they make a decree, it cannot be undone. It becomes a law, a permanent law for all time. So, to break it down, the king made a drunken request of his hot wife to come and parade around in front of his drunk friends. She refused and is cast off her throne forever. So we see that even though Vashti doesn't have much going on for her in the beginning of the story, this particular part of the story is important for us to figure out what's going on later on. She's mentioned, she disobeys, and then is cast out forever. So next we have to talk about the big bad of the story. His name is Haman or Haman. It doesn't matter how you pronounce it, just do your best. Jeff, what is your pronunciation? Haman, that's what I thought.
It's appropriately responded with a lot of foot pounding.
Why?
It's a long story.
Okay.
Jewish tradition.
Okay, all right.
Anytime Mordecai's mentioned, we clap.
Okay, clapping and foot stomping are our two responses for the hero and the bad guy. All right, so Haman. Esther, if you want to follow along, it's in Esther chapter 3, 1 through 4, and this is what it says. It says, after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But, dun dun dun, Mordecai would not kneel down, would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why do you disobey the king's command? Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them that he was a Jew. Haman is described as an Agagite, or an Agagite. An Agagite is a person in the family line of Agag. Does that name sound familiar? You guys are not reading your Old Testament word for word from beginning to end? No? You don't know Agag? Okay, so Agag was a king of a people group called the Amalekites. Everybody say Amalekites. Do you know who the Amalekites are? Not really. Yeah, so they are people who were the enemies of the Jews. The term Agagite is understood to be an ethnonym. Do you know what an ethnonym is? I didn't either. I had to look it up. An ethnonym is a name applied to a very specific people group. Agagite is not really like a group of people. It's not a tribe. It's named for the people who were heirs to King Agag. Weird. So the word Agagite is used to label Haman figuratively as a descendant of King Agag, the enemy of Israel and king of the enemy of the Jews. It's crazy. Haman, as an Amalekite, is opposed to Mordecai, the descendant of Kish. And because of their animosity between one another, there's like this mutually self-destructive struggle between Mordecai and Haman. And it's representative of the fights between the Jews and the Amalekites. With this understanding, instead of calling him Agagite, there was a Greek translator that called him a Macedonian. It's weird. An Agagite can either be a symbolic or literal term for somebody who is an anti-Semite. Okay? So from this introduction, we recognize that Haman, while he is a great friend of the king, is not a good friend of the Jews, okay? He is what we would call an anti-Semite. And this is an important part of the story that we'll find out more later on that we'll have to come back to. So now, let's get introduced to Mordecai and Esther. So there's a lot of introduction to get to the main story, and this comes from Esther 2, 5-7. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. And so that's the introduction that we have to Mordecai and his cousin Esther, okay? Mordecai and Esther were Jews who ended up being dispersed throughout the Persian Empire, right? They were actually children of families who were taken out of their Jewish tradition and culture in the year 722. The Babylonian Empire went into the northern kingdom of Israel, took a lot of the wealthy, took a lot of the well-respected, took a lot of the governors and the satraps and all the people who would have been important in Israel, and they dispersed them all throughout the Babylonian Empire. This was known as the Babylonian exile, and it happened in the year 722 BCE. As a result of this, so we recognize that Mordecai and Esther were both born into captivity. But later on, the Persians conquered the Greeks. And the Babylonians. The Persian conquered the Babylonians. And it happened in the year 539 BCE. And during that period of time, many of the Jews decided they were going to move out of where they were located, dispersed throughout the Babylonian Empire. And they moved to sometimes close by cities. Sometimes, they moved back to other locations nearer towards Israel. But in 538 to 537 BCE, Jews began returning to their homeland. They went back to Israel. They went back to rebuild the temple. They went back to rebuild the city walls. But here it's clear that for some reason, Mordecai and Esther didn't do that. So here they are in the capital city of Susa, the Persian Empire's capital. The main story of the book of Esther revolves around the events that happen after King Xerxes gets so mad at Vashti because she didn't come to present herself when the king commanded her to. Scripture says that he got so mad that he burned with rage and he deposed her and then asked his advisors what he should do. So he gathered around his best advisors, which is something that the Persian king always did. He had great counsel. He invited him to come to him and let's make a plan. What are we going to do now that Vashti's off her throne? So let's read what happens. It comes from Esther chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. According to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? Xerxes asked. She has not obeyed the command of the king Xerxes that the eunuchs had given to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and all the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. I don't know how not showing up to be paraded around does that kind of damage, but everybody's hurting. All right, 17 says, for the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of the king. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. Amen. I don't hear loud applause here, gentlemen. Why are we not? We're not? Okay, all right. Not a good idea to intimidate all the women around you to treat their husbands like they are kings, right? So this answer that King Xerxes had from his best advisors was, let's make sure that no other women treat their husbands like you got treated. And so they send out this edict so that everybody in the realm knows exactly what happened to Vashti. And the king obviously liked this idea, so he put on a search for a replacement queen all throughout the Persian Empire. And so he was looking for all the young women, all the virgins in the empire, and they were brought to the king. And they were all treated with like makeup and oils, and they were fed a special diet, and they spent a year preparing to be introduced to the king. And finally, the king got women paraded in front of him, woman after woman, day after day, night after night. And eventually, he sees Esther and friends, hubba hubba, okay? And he falls in love Everybody say, aw. Because Valentine's Day, right? We're working, see the connection here? So even though he falls in love with her, she has to do what she's told because she's a woman in the empire. And so she is married to the king, and she chooses at the request of Mordecai not to tell anyone that she's a Jew. So no one knows her heritage. So the king throws a big banquet and he hosts a celebration. And at this celebration, Mordecai was at the king's gate, kind of checking on Esther, the woman that he had raised as his own daughter. And while he was coming to check on Esther, he overhears a conversation between two of the king's servants. And this is where the plot thickens. You can find this in Esther chapter 2, 19 through 23. Here's what it says. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So in case you didn't know this, and we're not going to talk about it today, but one of the favorite ways that the king of the Persian Empire wanted to kill people was murdering them and putting them on poles. You're welcome. In this moment, we see that Mordecai overhears some assassination talk, tells his daughter, Esther, about the situation. She goes to tell the king and then credits Mordecai for doing this. Now enter Haman. We know that Haman is a good friend and close advisor of the king because we already read about that. But now we need to get some more depth on how he feels about Mordecai. So after the king has picked out his new bride, the banquet's been held, and the holiday has come and gone, Xerxes decides that he's going to honor Haman as like his BFF, right? And so the problems begin almost immediately because the king requires everyone to bow down to Haman, but Mordecai would not. And this made Haman really angry, so angry, in fact, that he burned with anger. And he went to the king and asked to kill Mordecai. So let's read what that says in Esther 3, 5 through 11. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of only killing Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And he says, "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." All of this came about because Haman believed his own hype, right? He was filled with pride and he thought that he deserved to be bowed down to. He was clearly the hero of his own story. He didn't need God. He acted as if he kind of was God. The king loves me, that's all I need. And as a result of his own pride, he asked that a genocide take place. Friends, when we use the word genocide, does that mean something to you? We've seen it in our own lifetimes, what genocide looks like. And here we have a guy that says, "Now, king, I want to kill all this particular people." And the king says, "Yeah, go for it. As a matter of fact, I know you've offered to give me like 20 quadrillion pounds of dollars, right? Like that's really what he's saying. I'm going to give you an unlimited amount of money. 10,000 talents is a lot." And the king says, "I don't need your money. Just destroy all the people." That's crazy to think about. But it looks like Mordecai and the entire race of Jews, men, women, babies, grandmothers, their fate is sealed. Those who still live within the realm of the Persians were destined for destruction because one man had his widow feelers hurt. And it's interesting that they put a price on genocide, right? 10,000 talents of gold is so much money, but it doesn't even matter because the king says, don't worry about it, just take them out. But the good news is Mordecai had a plan. The woman that he raised as his daughter was Jewish and married to the king. Surely the king would listen to Esther, his own wife. So Mordecai hurried off to the king's gate in sackcloth because he was mourning this decree. And he tried to get Esther's attention. And so Esther sent a eunuch down there to have conversation with Mordecai. And this eunuch goes back and forth telling stories, talking about what's going on. And here's what happens next in Esther 4:4-17. It says, she sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned to the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So whether we know it or not, God is at work in the situations we face. Even when we don't see him or recognize him. God's got people who are kingdom insiders. Some of them, like Mordecai, who recognize when bad things are going to happen, and God moves them to act. Mordecai heard what was going on, and he remembered that God had placed him in the right place at the right time, with the right connections to do something to help avoid the destruction of his entire people group. Now, he recognizes that he didn't have the power, but he knew somebody who did. And sometimes, friends, let me remind you that even if we don't have this incredible power and we don't think that we can make a huge difference, sometimes we know the person who can. And sometimes the least we can do is go and tell that person who can make a difference how they can make a difference. And that's what Mordecai does here. So we see the whole conversation between Mordecai and Esther, and she's nervous, right? Because there's a law, and we know that these Persians, they take their laws pretty seriously. They write them down, and it's on the law books forever. You cannot come to the king unless he invites you in by sending a scepter or word for you. And it's been 30 days since she's been there. So she's nervous. I can't approach the king. If I do and he doesn't extend the scepter, I die. That's just it. I'm done. Mordecai reminds her, even if you make it through these next few days. Even if you decide you don't want to act, God is going to do something. He's going to bring somebody up who will replace you, and that person will act. But you won't escape destruction. Do you think you're the only Jew who will escape destruction? And so she decides in that moment, I have to do what I'm being asked to do. So Esther gets the courage, 3 days later, goes in to the king, and I can't imagine how nervous she was standing there at a distance, waiting, trying to make eye contact in the presence of the king to see if he would accept her or reject her, knowing that her life was on the very line. And the king extends his scepter. And so Esther is invited in, and he looks at her and says, oh, wow. Thank you for coming to see me. If there is anything you want, even if it's half of the kingdom, I will give it to you. What can I do for you? And she says, just come to a banquet. You and Haman, come to this banquet I'm going to throw. It was there in the middle of this banquet. Actually, it was 2 banquets. He had one, or she had one the first time, invited them to come and just spend time. The next one was the next day, invited them to come back. But it was at this banquet that she would reveal to the king that she was Jewish and that Haman had tricked the king into signing her very death warrant. Let's read this together in Esther 7, 1-7. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king asked her, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. That's pretty brazen words. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther said, an adversary and enemy, this vile Haman, dun, 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 right? Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up, and in a rage, he left his wine, which is like a mortal sin. We don't leave wine. And he walks out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. But his begging wouldn't matter, because the king walked in on him begging her, and it made him even more upset. He got so mad, in fact, that he immediately had Haman executed for his horrible attempt to end the life of the Jews and his queen. And we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks, but today we have to talk about the fact that throughout this whole story, while it's named after Esther, God is acting in the moments we don't easily recognize. God is working in the council of Xerxes' advisors. Find a new queen. God is working in Mordecai's interception of the news of an attempted assassination. He's at the right place in the right time to hear the conniving stewards. God is working in and through the eunuchs who are in charge of the king's harem, who counsel Esther on what she needs to do, what she needs to wear, what she needs to bring into the presence of the king to impress him. God is acting through Esther's being chosen as queen of an empire, even though she was an outsider. She was Jewish. God put her in the right place at the right time. God was at work through the decision of Mordecai to request that Esther keep her heritage secret. In this beautiful book that doesn't even actually mention the name God, it's clear to see that God is active. God is alive and at work in the world. Just because we don't recognize it in the moment, the handwriting of God is behind all of it. And whether we recognize it or not, the same is true today. God is moving and alive and active in the world around us, even though oftentimes he goes unnoticed because our attention is being pulled 1,000 miles an hour to many different places. God is actively working for the good of his people. The word we use to describe this God action is the word providence. Have you heard that word before? Providence means the protective care of God as a spiritual power, the guardianship and control exercised by God, or a manifestation of God's foresightful care for his creatures. The reality is, while we believe that God allows us to make our own decisions and choose our own path, God has given us incredible free will. God's providence is always at work to guide us closer to him and to be a part of his story. So again, in this book that doesn't mention his name once, it is clear that God is the hero in the book of Esther. And the truth is that God is the real hero of our stories too, whether we recognize it or believe it or not. He's been working in your life the whole time. And often we ignore it. When we don't recognize him, when we are blind to what he is doing right around us, God is still at work to bring about the best situations possible for us. And all we have to do is recognize it and follow along where God leads. Friends, it's time for each of us to step up and realign our lives with God's purposes for us. This week and always, let us be willing to respond to God's activity. Let us open our eyes to the ways that God has been working to weave our lives together and trust him fully with whatever our present situations are. This week and always, let us be people that seek to find God at work in the world, and let us seek to join in that work. That's how we help bring about God's kingdom right here and right now. Friends, God has so much for us in the book of Esther, and I can't wait to dive even deeper in as the weeks progress. So I hope you got the overarching story today. We're going to see a lot more of the themes in the coming weeks.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's Community Cast. We hope that you were blessed by today's conversation. If you'd like to know more about Community Brookside, please feel free to visit us at our website, communitybrookside.com, or find us on your favorite social media outlet. We hope to hear from you soon. Be blessed.